Welcome. You're here because the question of attacking Iran and its uranium enrichment facilities are at the top of the national security policy agenda these days. There are many issues involved concerning the legitimacy of the strategy and objectives of a potential military action. And among them are how effective an attack might be, according to what criteria for judgment. To reflect in detail on these questions, it's hard to think of a better qualified set of experts than this panel, who are all leaders in the worlds of diplomacy, the DC policymaking arena, sensitive military operations, and scholarship. Now, of course, the most important achievement that all of them can claim is having taught courses at SIPA. I don't believe in long introductions that repeat the full qualifications and illustrious achievements of our speakers, since they have been publicized to you before, but I have found that sometimes there are people who, for one reason or another, are ignorant of things they should know of this sort. So let me just briefly mention the panelists. Ambassador William H. Luers, who among very many achievements now directs the Iran Project. He was formerly president of the United Nations Association, president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, ambassador to Czechoslovakia and Venezuela, many other posts in his career in the Foreign Service, including Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and for Inter-American Affairs. And he was, at the beginning of his career, a U.S. Navy officer, something he shares with Admiral Olson. And he's taught elsewhere. We'll forgive him for doing courses at SAIS, the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, and George Washington. Leslie H. Gelb, Pulitzer Prize winner, has also been a senior official in the State and Defense Departments. He's currently President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, where he was my boss. He is a graduate of Tufts, so PhD from Harvard, and he's the author of Anglo-American Relations 1945 to 1950, Toward a Theory of Alliances, the Irony of Vietnam, of which he was the senior author, a book dear to my heart, which also won the Woodrow Wilson Award of the American Political Science Association. And his other two books, Our Own Worst Enemy, Claiming the Heavens, and many other achievements. And Admiral Eric T. Olson, who is now teaching a course for us here at SIPA entitled America's Evolving Military Strategy in an Asymmetric Age. He's a Navy SEAL who spent his career in special operations with many decorations for leadership and valor. He rose to become head of the United States Special Operations Command, which is responsible for the mission readiness of all Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps Special Operations Forces. And in addition to teaching us here at Columbia, he's now an independent national security consultant involved in advising many organizations and government agencies. And Professor Austin Long, one of our own here at the School of International and Public Affairs, and a member of the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, which is happy to be sponsoring this event. Austin's interests and research revolve around low-intensity conflict, intelligence, military operations, nuclear forces, military intervention, and the political economy of national security. He's worked at the RAND Corporation as an analyst and advisor to Multinational Force Iraq's Task Force 134 and the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, and he was an analyst and advisor to Combined Forces Special Operations Component Command in Afghanistan. He's a graduate of Georgia Tech and his PhDs from MIT. I don't want to waste any more time in hearing from the people who have the most to say on the subject. So on this extraordinarily timely and important issue, I turn things over to Ambassador Luers.
Thank you, Dick. I'm so pleased that this is all SIPA. Every one of us have had association. In addition to that, I went to SIPA graduate school, so I'm a real student of this place and admire it greatly. But you didn't mention Iris Bierry, who is my colleague, and stand up, Iris. Iris is a former graduate student. She left a couple of years ago and has been an invaluable partner for all of us in this project. Let me tell you how I'd like to do this, how we would like to do it. I will introduce this paper, some of which you've been able to get a summary of, and explain sort of why we did it. Then Austin Long, who I discovered through various different channels, who said he would be the best to do this, basically started us on this paper in April, I think it was, by preparing a fact-based analysis of their nuclear program, our problems with it, and the military aspects of dealing with it. And he spent a lot of time at it, and he's worked with us all the way to the final product. And his capacity is to bring the facts to the table and do it without, his passion is for understanding the problem and dealing with what we know about them, and not telling a story what he thinks about them. And he helped us set the tone for the whole paper, which was the objective of the paper, given our belief that this subject has been dealt with a lot of passion on the part of a lot of individuals, particularly in this electoral campaign, and never mind the Israeli role, which has all added a lot of background noise to something that we have to understand. So, Austin, thank you for helping us with that. And then Eric Olson, Admiral Olson, who's now teaching here, who has been part of this from the very beginning. I've traveled with him, and we've spoken on this subject to several different audiences. And his perspective is not the normal perspective you get on these issues, because he looks at it, since we're talking about military, he's looking at it uniquely from a military point of view. Then Les will sort of wrap it up. Les, who's noted for wanting to reach between the use of power in the hardware point of view and on the other hand, the diplomatic political point of view, and has written about it, has tried to reach a balance in the way we talk about these issues. And he will sort of give you the guts of what the report says. Now, in summarizing it, I guess I'd just say several things. First, a group of us for 10 years have been working on Iran. Nothing in my background would give you any sense that I know anything about this country, and not many people do know a lot about it, but I don't know a lot. I know a lot less than people who've been working with us on it. But I have been dealing with the Iran government, the U.S. government, on how to deal with this particular issue of this relationship for a long time. This year we decided, because there was indeed, and we'd not anticipated the degree to which it had happened, but we anticipated a large, heated debate over precisely the issue of use of military force. So what we set out to do, and having not gone public before very often, we set out to try to do something different by saying, in a highly politicized environment, these are the issues you should think about when you think about use of military force. All of us were conscious of the fact that when we went into Iraq, it was quite evidently the cost side was not analyzed very carefully. And had it been, we might be in a different situation today. Indeed, we went to one senator, and I tried to persuade him that when we finished this paper, he's been involved in talking to us about the paper, when we finished it, would he agree to have hearings on his committee about this? And he said two things. First, he said, no, I won't have hearings, because if I have hearings, if the Democrats should call for hearings on this subject the way you're developing it, the president would think that we're undercutting his effort to establish the credibility that the United States is prepared to use military force. which is a key component of his strategy in trying to get them to negotiate seriously about the nuclear program. Then he said, on the other hand, had we had such a hearing in October, November of 2002, we might not have ended up in Iraq. Most of the people we talked to were of those two minds in Washington. Do it, it's important, but look out, it causes problems with the administration's strategy. So what we did is Austin wrote this first piece of it, then I and some others shaped it into the message we wanted to convey and trying to make sure we had a fair balance of the costs and benefits. And then we began to circulate it. And interesting things happened as we gathered together some 35 people, and you see them in this summary, those people who signed on, some of the more prominent individuals in the United States dealing with these issues, is each of them began to play a role. They got engaged in it. And we ended up with this paper, which was quite significantly changed from the way we started. And it changed in a very positive direction. This wasn't a committee paper, because the committee, the group that got together, were not carrying a message. Only thing they contributed to was a careful, detailed analysis of the problem. We don't come up with any recommendations, to the frustration of some people who signed it. We don't have a point of view. The only point of view is look at the facts. So that's where we are, and I think, Austin, you're the fact guy. Get us started, okay?
Thanks very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm on leave from SEPA this year, but it's always great to be back here. I got interested in the question of the Iranian nuclear program and military force against it in 2004, 2005. And the primary driver of my interest was I noticed a more or less perfect alignment between people's preferences about what to do about the Iranian nuclear program and what they thought militarily could be done. So if you thought bombing was a bad idea, you thought it was also impossible. If you thought bombing was a great idea, you thought it would be easy. Now, in my observation, that's almost always a red flag to analysts. If people's preferences and facts perfectly align, it's usually a tip-off that somebody hasn't done their homework on one or both sides of an issue. So I and a colleague of mine at MIT, who's a nuclear engineer, really started trying to dig into the nitty-gritty of the Iranian nuclear program and Iranian defenses, Israeli capabilities, specifically the US capabilities, as I'll talk to in a minute, are much greater to deal with the Iranian program. But that's how I got into this, and I've been more or less obsessive about it ever since. So it was an easy sell when Bill asked me to write this paper. It was something that I've sort of written on and chewed on mentally for a long time now. So I'm going to talk about three sort of key pieces of the paper. I encourage you to read it. It's actually quite short and quite digestible. There's long footnotes if you're into the nitty-gritty technical detail, but Bill and Iris, I think, particularly shaped it into something that normal people can read and enjoy, at least as much as you can enjoy such things. So I'm going to talk about three pieces. The first is, what do we know about the Iranian nuclear program? What are the key pieces in terms of getting towards a nuclear weapon? The second will be the role of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and Western intelligence in monitoring the program and our confidence in that monitoring. And the third thing will be, as I alluded to, the difference in Israeli and US military capabilities to attack the program, which really have been the main driver in the past year's sort of emerging crisis over the program. And why the Israelis, as Ehud Barak has publicly said, face essentially a different timeline than the United States that's driving them to potentially act much sooner than the US would like. So first, what do we know about the program itself? The key to understanding what the furor about the program is about is enrichment of uranium. This is the key bit of any nuclear program, is the production of nuclear material that you can use to make a bomb. We can talk in Q&A if you want about weapons design. The judgment of the US intelligence community, which I think is right, and the IAEA has come to, I think, similar conclusions, is the Iranians were messing around with weapons design before 2003, in part because of the observation of what happened to Iraq in 2003. They suspended that weaponization activity and have at least as yet not resumed it. We can talk about that more in Q&A, but I'm going to focus on the critical bit of uranium enrichment, because you can have the greatest bomb design in the world, you got no weapons-grade uranium or weapons-grade plutonium, you got no bomb. So what do we know about enrichment? The Iranians have been enriching for some time. The key number that you're looking for, typically for producing a weapon is 90% enriched uranium. When we talk about enrichment, we mean the presence of the uranium-235 isotope, which is actually useful for nuclear weapons, in the sample of uranium. Typically in natural uranium, that percentage is less than 1%. So when you hear 90%, it's 90% U-235, which is more than 100 times the enrichment level found in natural uranium. So the Iranians have already used gas centrifuges, which is one of the ways you can enrich. They spin very quickly and take advantage of the differential weight in isotopes to make, as it passes through each centrifuge, the uranium gets a little higher in concentration of U-235, and if you string enough of them together, you can produce highly enriched material. So the Iranians have already enriched a substantial amount of uranium to about 3.5%. So this is roughly 5 times the normal level. And the reason they've done this is to power potential nuclear power reactors. In other words, reactors that will be used to produce electricity for commercial purposes. The Iranians don't really have any of these built, really. They have one at Bushehr that has finally gone online but isn't all that functional. But they do have a legitimate reason to produce this material. This worries the international community. Any Iranian enrichment worries the international community a bit, but this does not worry the international community as much as uranium that's been enriched to 20%, which the Iranians have a much smaller stockpile of, but is much more worrying to the international community because 20% and 90% sound like they're quite far apart. But in terms of the work done to move from 20% to 90%, it's much, much less than moving from the natural level to 20%. So in terms of work, 20% enriched uranium is already 90% of the way to 90%. So the concern is if the Iranians have a large stockpile of this 20% enriched uranium, they can then just very quickly run it through their centrifuges sort of one last pass and have weapons-grade uranium. So that's the central concern with the Iranian program right now. The other concern, which for the US is less, but as I'll talk to in a minute, is much more for the Israelis, is an underground facility north of the city of Qum called Fordo. Fordo is a very deeply buried facility, depending on whose unclassified numbers you buy. It's some 200 to 300 feet underground. It's a very robustly defended target. The issue with Fordo from the Israelis is it changes the calculus of what they can actually do. All other Iranian sites are pretty vulnerable. Fordo is much more difficult. So the Fordo facility was first publicly announced in 2009. It was discovered by Western intelligence and subsequently verified by the IAEA. From 2009 to 2011, nothing happened at Fordo. In 2011, the Iranians started putting gas centrifuges into Fordo. And they've gone very quickly from last fall, roughly this time, having 0 centrifuges there, to at last count, last public count by the IAEA in August, 2,100 centrifuges. The facility is designed to hold about 2,800, so the prediction, which I think is right, is that by the end of the year, if not before, this facility will be fully functional. Some of those centrifuges are already operating, about 700 of them. There's an open question about whether any of the others work because the Iranians have had problems with their centrifuge program. But at least on the surface, it looks like this facility will be completed. So that's the central concern driving this crisis, is a growing stockpile of this 20% enriched uranium and the completion of the Fordo facility. So now I'll move on to talking about monitoring what's going on with the Iranian program. I'm happy to touch on any more details about the Iranian program itself in Q&A, but those are the critical bits. So what do we know and how do we know about the Iranian nuclear program? There are 2 principal sources that act to reinforce one another. The first are inspectors and monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The IAEA has personnel that monitor all of the declared Iranian nuclear facilities. There are about 24 of them. There's not personnel present there 24/7, but there are video cameras. The personnel do visit weekly or roughly weekly. They produce quarterly reports based on those visits. And so it's a pretty intensive inspection regime. And it means that you have people that physically go in and verify how much of this 20% medium enriched uranium, this 20% enriched uranium, that the Iranians have produced. They verify where it is and how much it is. They verify the 3.5% enriched uranium. They verify centrifuges and which ones are actually working and which aren't to an extent. So there is a pretty intrusive and effective inspections regime that operates under the auspices of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Simultaneously, there is intensive monitoring by Western intelligence, principally but not exclusively the United States and Israel. These intelligence agencies use a variety of sources: human intelligence, signals intelligence, overhead imagery intelligence, a variety of measurement and signatures intelligence to monitor the program. And these two sources of information are mutually reinforcing. And the way they mutually reinforce is the IAEA has great ability to verify known sites. It has very little ability to ferret out on its own undeclared sites. Western intelligence has essentially the opposite problem. They have a lot of ability to sort of flag sites as potentially suspicious, but no right to go sort of directly poke around. So what has typically happened, and there are two concrete examples of this, Western intelligence has discovered a suspicious site. They've publicly sort of named and shamed Iran. The IAEA says, were you ever going to tell us about this site? The Iranians sort of sheepishly say, yeah, we were going to get around to it. And then IAEA begins inspecting. This has happened with both of Iran's enrichment facilities. So the original enrichment facility at Natanz, which is larger than Fordo, was originally a clandestine underground facility. In 2002, it was publicly acknowledged by the Iranians after Western intelligence essentially said, we know what you're up to. It's been under IAEA inspection ever since. The same thing happened with Fordo. According to unclassified sources, Western intelligence began monitoring the Fordo site in its construction phase beginning in 2007. It was not until 2009 that they had sufficiently good intelligence to say, we have high confidence that the Iranians intend to use this for enrichment. Once they had that information and provided it to the IAEA, Fordo became under the IAEA inspection regime. So the reason I spend time on this is one of the big questions that emerged in the course of writing this paper is, how confident can we be that we know where all of Iran's enrichment facilities and other nuclear facilities are? And the answer I come to, which I think there's still probably some variance in the various signatories of the paper, but my own perspective is we can have pretty high confidence. No intelligence is of course, going to be 100% effective, but in terms of what we know about the Iranian program and what's been discoverable about it, we're doing pretty well. The Iranians don't have unlimited resources, so they can't spend infinite money building infinite hidden facilities, and we're pretty good at detecting the two they have tried to build. Now there could always be a third that we haven't detected, but at least on the face of it, that doesn't seem to be the case. And again, we can talk more about that in Q&A if you want, but it's my belief, based on looking at these two mutually reinforcing sources of information, we can have pretty high confidence we know where at least all of the industrial scale facilities are. I'm not going to sit here and claim there's not some small lab somewhere we don't know about, but in terms of industrial scale production of enriched uranium, it's my considered opinion that there's very low likelihood the Iranians have anything we don't know about. The other question is, what's the warning time should the Iranians decide to take this step I described of beginning to enrich this 20% enriched uranium to 90% for a bomb? In other words, how confident can the United States be that if the Iranians start down this path, we will be able to act in time should we choose to use military force to prevent it? And again, based on what we know about these two sources of information, I think we will have weeks or potentially more to act. As I say, the inspectors visit these declared facilities routinely and have continuous monitoring of these facilities. So if the Iranians are going to use these known facilities to enrich, in other words, they're going to start just jamming this 20% into the same centrifuges that they used to produce it in the first place to get to 90%, inspectors will catch them. Their other alternative is to kick out inspectors. Well, kicking out inspectors will raise hell, essentially. I mean, everyone in the world will know it. And there can be really only one reason, I think most people would agree, for the Iranians to do this, at least at this point. So I think the inspectors will detect any attempt to use these overt facilities. If there's a covert set of facilities, as I said, I think the Western intelligence has been pretty good at finding these facilities. So it's only if you believe that there's a covert industrial scale facility and that the Iranians can move a lot of this 20% enriched uranium there covertly, again, this material is under inspection, can there be a situation where the United States doesn't have a substantial warning time on when the Iranians attempt to break out? That's the key takeaway, I think, on what we know about the program in those timelines. The final bit, since I'm already talking too much, will be on the difference between Israeli and U.S. military capability. This is something I've thought about a lot. The bottom line is, before the creation of the Fordo facility, the Israelis had a pretty high confidence military option against most of the key bits of the Iranian nuclear program. So they could have high confidence in destroying the first Iranian nuclear enrichment program or facility at Natanz, some other ancillary facilities at Esfahan that do conversion and fabrication work, some of the centrifuge production sites. The Israelis had a pretty high confidence option against that. And again, I'm happy to talk in depth in the weeds and Q&A about why I believe that. But it's a pretty substantial option. Fordo changes that, because essentially the Israelis don't have big enough planes and big enough bombs. They have F-15 long-range strike aircraft that can carry 5,000-pound bunker busters. If you do the math on it, it's likely to require somewhere between 8 and 12 of these weapons striking the same impact point to essentially tunnel down into Fordo. This would be unprecedented in terms of effectiveness. The most anybody's ever done in terms of this is basically one after another. So 1, 2 you can do. It's never been demonstrated that you can do 8 to 12. And there's reason to believe even if you could do it, it would be very, very difficult. So that doesn't look very promising. The other option people have discussed is some sort of special operations mission. I will leave it to Admiral Olson to describe the possibility of doing this. I'll just note that the longest range operation the Israelis have done of this type was at Entebbe in the 1970s. Entebbe is an airport, so it's pretty easy to land a plane at an airport. The target was the terminal right next to the airport. So you get off the plane, you're very quickly at the target. There's not a runway right next to Fordo. So that, I think, alone makes it more questionable about whether this could be pulled off. But as I said, we have one of the world's leading experts, so I'll turn it over to him for that. The United States, on the other hand, does have very large planes and very large bombs. The most public of which is a 30,000-pound bunker buster known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. We have B-2 aircraft that can carry 2 of these bombs. While one cannot say with 100% certainty this would be successful in destroying the Fordo facility, it has a much, much greater chance of doing so than the Israeli option. The other big thing that's different is the United States can mount a sustained campaign. Most analysts, myself included, don't think the Israelis can maintain this sort of long-range strike for more than 1 or 2 nights. The United States has the potential to maintain it more or less indefinitely from bases in the region, from bases outside the region, and from ships at sea in the region. So the greater U.S. military capability, as I said, leads to this different timeline. The Israelis believe they're essentially running out of time. From 2005 till last year, every Israeli I talked to would make sort of noises about how they're running out of time, but it was always in a very nebulous way. Red lines would shift and sort of mutate over time. Over the past year, that's become very different because you're not talking about political red lines, you're talking about military technical red lines. The Israelis, had they acted a year ago, would have potentially substantially delayed the Iranian nuclear program in a way that's less true today, and however much delay they can expect from an attack now will be substantially less by next year. And that's essentially what Prime Minister Netanyahu was talking about in his address to the UN General Assembly, that time for the Israelis is fundamentally running out in a way that it isn't for the US. And that's really what's driven this crisis, is the Israelis see a closing window of opportunity that the United States does not, at least yet, face. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me make a couple of points on. I mean, that was about as good an exposition as I've heard him make on this subject. But he said that one of the issues that was debated was whether or not there's any clandestine site that's been built by Iran. That did become a source of considerable disagreement among our 35 signers, and there was a lot of engagement in it. We ultimately came out more or less where Austin came out, but we did have some footnotes which suggested another point of view, and I think that's important. The second point was how much warning will we have? Now, the warning about what is the issue? Warning about them going to enrichment and trying to get to weapons grade uranium. I think the estimate we come out with is a week to several months, and that was driven by Austin. Others said, including the Secretary of Defense, that it would take them a year before they could have an operable weapon. And then others suggested that it'd take several years before they could have a real weapons capacity. So the time from we first identify that they have begun to enrich to a level where they could build a weapon, to the time where they have a weapon, and then to the time where they have a weapons capacity, which would be more than one weapon, that probably is several years. So we tried to deal with that issue. On the one issue that we kept being asked about by people who were signing on, of course you believe they're going to build a weapon. And we stayed away from that. We stuck to the facts. We didn't talk about intentions. We talked about the indications that they seem to be headed in that direction against the indications that they seem to be saying that there's a fatwa against it, and they might not do it, at least unless they're encouraged. So is that okay?
Absolutely.
All right, good. Admiral Olson?
Thank you. First, let me say it's good to be with you. I'm 5 weeks into my first semester at SEPA, and quite impressed with the quality of the school, and especially with the students that I'm privileged to have in my class, and I know that some of them are here this afternoon. I'll start by saying that I don't claim to be an expert on Iran. I've spent some time thinking about Iran, as many others have, but I don't claim anywhere near the level of expertise as my colleagues from academia or the diplomatic corps or the policy community. And the time that I have spent thinking about Iran has been probably from for a different purpose than they have spent than the time they have spent thinking about it. I've never been to Iran myself. And I would say that I'm probably have thought about Iran different than my colleagues in the military community have as well. I've spent my career in the special operations community. It's fundamentally different from the big Army, big Air Force, big Navy, big Marine Corps in the way that it operates. Generally operating in small teams in remote places where they don't have the advantage of mass. They don't generally hold terrain. They don't generally have control of big and complex weapon systems. But they are in places where the situation is often tense. They learn to live by their wits. They learn to find other ways to do what has to be done. There's a spirit of innovation, a level of cleverness within the special operations community, and I find an overlap between that and this project, really about stimulating a different way of thinking about a problem that, from a pure military perspective, may seem to be fairly simple: fly over, drop big bombs, and destroy the target. But in reality, is far more complex than that. I'll talk about it in three general ways. First, in terms of sort of the military maxim of shoot, the military maxim of shoot, move, and communicate. This is taught in schools as what you need to know to accomplish what needs to be done. If you can shoot, move, and communicate, you're probably in pretty good shape from a military perspective of being able to address the military challenge. There's a growing sense now that that's simply insufficient. That you can shoot, move, and communicate, but it leaves a big area unaddressed, and that's the understanding. That without understanding, the shooting, moving, and communicating don't make much sense. They may be for the wrong purpose. And without an ability to know whether you achieved your desired effect. So this understanding is very, very important. It's understanding the operational context of the place, understanding the possible or probable responses of the adversary or potential adversary that you're dealing with, understanding what may happen in the countries around it, understanding how leaders think, how societies behave, what success means to them, not just to us, what their paradigms are that we may not understand. And from a tactical sense, it means really understanding the true nature of the military target set itself. It's been addressed that there's a high level of confidence that the intelligence is pretty comprehensive, but I don't know anybody in the intelligence community who will say with certainty that we know everything there is to know about the Iranian nuclear program, even though it may be the most watched place by the global intelligence communities at this point. And then it strikes me that the shoot, move, communicate, understand is entirely backwards. It's understand, communicate, move, and when and if necessary, shoot. And so addressing it from that point of view is exactly what this project has taken on. It's really about getting the understanding right first before you get drawn into or make a decision to do something that may have unknown or unintended consequences. Second, I'll talk about phase -1. Military planning is generally conducted in 6 phases. Phase 0 is a shaping phase. Phase 1 is a deterrence phase. Phase 2 is seizing the initiative. Phase 3, dominating. Phase 4, stabilizing. And phase 5, handing over to civil authorities with fairly precise indicators of when to shift from one phase to the next, all in accordance with a carefully crafted plan. But my point here is that phase 0 doesn't start soon enough. Nearly every war game I've attended, nearly every exercise in which I've participated, it begins with something like, okay, an incident just occurred in this place. A 10-kiloton bomb went off, an earthquake happened, there was a border patrol, a border crossing incident, a terrorist attack. What do we do now? Let's develop courses of action to present for approval. And my contention here is that the opening piece of any war game ought to be, an incident occurred. What should we have done, or what might we have done 10 years ago or 20 years ago to prevent us from having to address it in this way now? And that planning can't be done by the Department of Defense. That's an interagency planning effort because the Department of Defense doesn't own all of the actions that need to be done 10 or 20 years in advance. And so again, this project raises that concept to the point of really thinking this through from an interagency perspective, not just a military perspective. It addresses military strike, but it talks about it in a much broader context of what other things might be done without addressing them specifically, but raising the specter that other things can be done in order to keep from reaching a crisis. And then third, I'll just call watch the gap. Words taken from the sign as you get on the Long Island Railroad. There is a gap between where classic diplomacy ends and where traditional military operations begin. And my sense is that we often cross that gap too quickly. There is a rich opportunity to explore. Within that gap, a wide range of options that go beyond classic diplomacy, but are still short of traditional, large-scale, kinetic military operations. And of course, this paper raises the level of consciousness regarding that very much as well. I've associated myself with this paper because it is not just bipartisan, as it's often described. It's way beyond that. It is non-partisan in the truest sense. And I don't think that, I know certainly for myself, and I I don't think that many of my former military colleagues would have associated themselves with this paper if it seemed to be political in any way, if it seemed to come to judgments or take positions or make recommendations. This is really sort of an umpire calling balls and strikes without regard for what the outcome of the game is. Just making sure that he's calling them as he sees them, and in this case, with an effort to stimulate a much higher level of discussion on the subject. Pastor.
All right, thank you very much. He's always so refreshing. When he mentioned the -1 plan before you get into the military operations, which I sort of like that formulation. What did you do? What could you have done that didn't get us to the point where we've got to start thinking about military operations? And what are the alternatives to military operations? And one of the issues that kept coming up, particularly with some of the people who signed it, well, you've said all this, you've talked about all the benefits and the costs that would come from using military force, but you haven't given an alternative. How can you do that without saying, well, what would you do instead of military action? We chose not to do that. As I said from the beginning, we chose, because once you do that, once you begin to talk about what should you do instead of military operations, you bias the discussion that you're trying to have, which is apolitical, it's professional, and it's non-judgmental. I gather you're not going to answer the question of whether the Israelis could use special operations to take out.
You gather correctly. I'll just say that it is a very difficult and complex operation, whether it's done from the air or on the ground.
Yeah, okay. Les, wrap it up.
Thank you. Hard to wrap this up. I didn't want to sign this paper. I don't like to sign any paper I don't write. I often don't like to see my signature on papers I did write. Groupthink doesn't appeal to me. And the traditional options paper in particular had no appeal to me, because everything in those papers, they're done in government all the time, everything just gets on the one hand and on the other hand, and you end up with no hand. Everything gets neutered. But when I read this, it wasn't the typical on the one hand, on the other hand paper. It did make judgments. As Admiral Olson said, this paper does call balls and strikes, but it does so fairly. Now, those of you not initiated in the secret ways of Washington will nonetheless be impressed by the group of signers. It really is an extraordinary bunch of people. And among the few in Washington, I think, who can call balls and strikes and be regarded as serious umpires. This paper really had to be done, as Bill said, because we were edging up, and we are edging up, to another war, and our democracy, our country, deserves to have the issues looked at with the greatest of care before decisions are made. It really is critical. Now, Bill also wanted me to make a few other points, which I'll do quickly. One is, as you read the paper, you'll see that the benefits are more crisply stated than the costs. And that's because we have a pretty good idea what the results of military action would be by the Israelis and by us. Israeli attack, at most 2 years setback for the Iranians. American attack, at best 4 years setback for the Iranians. But then we get into the costs, and the costs are very ephemeral. We really don't know what the consequences are going to be. And we're all making rather difficult judgments. But these are judgments made by people who have had the experiences of being wrong many times. And wrong mainly by seeing overestimates of what we can accomplish. This paper really is leavened by people who have a pretty damn good sense of what we can and cannot accomplish and what we can and cannot predict. Now, to the major conclusions. And I say conclusions because these are conclusions. It's not a neutered paper. One is that if there is an attack by either the Israelis or the United States or some combination of the two, that it will not mean the Iranian government collapses. This Iranian government. It will not mean that this Iranian government capitulates to a U.S. position. It will not mean that Iran abandons its quest, if that's what it's really doing, abandons its quest to develop nuclear weapons. Now, those are some pretty important judgments. You should know that while this group really does cover a good chunk of the ideological spectrum in foreign policy, it doesn't cover it all. I would say, it's fair to say, Bill, we leave out the neocons who don't think that there are any question marks. They have all the answers. And their answers to a lot of these questions are, we really can change the Iranian government. We really can get them to capitulate. That we ought to be more sanguine about the use of force. But we say this government is not going to collapse, even if we hit them hard. This government is not going to capitulate, even if we hit them hard. And this government is not going to abandon its quest for nuclear weapons. Indeed, and here is the punchline, and it's an extraordinary one for a group as diverse as this one to reach. And the punchline is, it's bound to make the surviving Iranian government even more determined to go nuclear. Stop at that point.
Great. Thank you, Les. You have a phrasing and a way to deal with things that puts everything in perspective. He doesn't like options, Les doesn't. We both worked for Kissinger at one point, and Kissinger always said that the State Department always gives me three options. The first is nuclear war. The third is total surrender. And the middle one is what they want, what they want me to do.
And it was true.
It's true.
Right.
Precisely. And his point about how we come out, I mean, the debate over what will happen if we were to attack Iran, in terms of how they will respond. We had a lot of debates over this subject, and Austin got into this, and so did many others, about what would be the Iranian reaction. If Israel struck, it would probably be directed totally at Israel, and in a way that would not encourage us to enter the fray. On the other hand, if we were to do it, the attack could be quite broad, but the general suspicion would be asymmetrical and not involve a lot of direct military attacks on U.S. Facilities, but other types of indirect attacks, including surrogates and the use of Shia terrorists, as well as, of course, Hezbollah. Another big discussion, which Les sort of hinted at, was this question of what would happen within the country if we were to attack. One conclusion was it would probably give them impetus to try to build a bomb, even if they hadn't decided already to do it, it would probably make them make that decision much easier. And that was one thing that was talked about a lot. We came out on the side of pressing them, of urging them to build the bomb if they were attacked. But the other is, how would the Iranian people react to this? Would this result in a strengthened Iranian government, or would it be weakened and maybe on the verge of collapse? And again, from prior experience that many of us have had, I guess our assumption is that when you strike from the air, you very often, or strike from any place, you very often end up with a government more consolidated, more determined, and more in control, and a population less likely to want to try to overthrow the government, even if that was possible in the first place. When Bundy decided, when Mac George Bundy in the mid-90s decided to tell the story of Vietnam, this is 20, 30 years after his involvement, and he did it in part because McNamara had already given his books, his story about the fog of war and his various books on the subject. So he felt he should do it. He went to a biographer, Gordon Goldstein, and Gordon asked him a number of questions because Bundy, the Yankee, couldn't get it out, couldn't get his reactions out very easily, and didn't have a lot of insight. But they read a lot of, a large number of his memoranda, his conversations with others, and one time Gordon asked him when he went home at night, said, "Tomorrow morning, give me the answer. What surprised you the most about Vietnam?" He came back the next day and he said, this is my biggest surprise. The endurance of the enemy and my real belief in coercion. And he elaborated, and of course it's a core point of the book, that he believed, as did the president and the entire U.S. government, and I was there at the time, believed that they couldn't take everything we were throwing at them indefinitely. And they did. And secondly, that he believed that that approach to an enemy worked. It had to work. It was eventually going to work. So we don't have that quote in this. It a little bit drives me to think about this issue the way we thought about it. But it also convinced me that and all of us, that telling this story as flatly as we can, without any bias, will help those of you who have to think about this, and those in the government who have to make decisions about it. So yeah.
Yeah, let me just add a word, since you got back into a history that I'm all too familiar with. I left out an important point that relates to what Bill just said, and that is, you all should understand that everyone who signed this report was not in favor of taking the military option off the table. That's very important. That is, whatever the true feelings were about whether or not to use force, no one wanted to take this off the table because there was sufficient experience in this group to say we needed that as an important pressure point, whatever we were going to end up doing. Now, related to what Bill was just saying, feeling that force eventually would compel the adversary to capitulate. In Vietnam and in almost every conflict, the fact that things don't seem to work out doesn't mean the argument over about the utility of force is ended, not by any means. Because as in the case of Vietnam, the argument still goes on that if we would have used more force earlier on and just pounded the North Vietnamese into the ground, then we could have produced a military victory. So the absence of a military victory in Vietnam or Iraq, whatever, doesn't mean that the arguments addressed in this paper ever end?
Les, my little anecdote about Bundy was an editorial, and we don't have editorials in this paper, and Les gave it the balance that it needed, because none of us, as he said, didn't believe that at some point the use of military force might be necessary, and it might be even decided to do it. And I don't think anybody would have signed this paper if that wasn't there. So thank you, Les, for bringing that up. Okay, any questions?
My first question is about, I recently read that Amos Yadlin, who was the Israeli intelligence chief until a few years ago, recently came out with a statement that he was, in fact, quite confident of Israel's military capability. He had confidence in Barak and the current IDF officials in setting back an Iranian threat pretty substantially. I guess this is specifically directed to Mr. Olson, but really anybody. What do you make of that in light that this panel so conclusively felt that the Israeli capability was quite limited?
Do you want to do it, Austin?
Sure. So, I mean, I've spent a lot of the past 7 years talking to both U.S. and Israeli folks about this, and I think absent the Fordo facility, the Israeli capability is pretty robust. Fordo, I think, changes things substantially. Now, bear in mind, you can find, and they're all footnoted in the paper, estimates that range from an Israeli capability at present could set the Iranian program back by more than 5 years, all the way down to less than 1 year. So there's a broad range of estimates out there. We spent a lot of time trying to use the available unclassified material to sort of come to what we thought were reasonable conclusions on that. So a lot depends on what you mean by deal with the program. I think large chunks of it the Israelis can have high confidence in. One big chunk, I think, much less so.
Thanks. My second question is about the legacy of U.S. military intervention. It sort of seemed like, again, Mr. Olson, when you were speaking about the new mindset about understanding first, it occurred to me that was very much influenced by the legacy of Afghanistan and Iraq and interventions in those countries. But that raised the question for me, why didn't that reshaping of opinion happen after Vietnam? And maybe you could reflect on that a bit.
I don't think I can. I can't explain why things didn't happen. But I will say I'm encouraged by the discussion that I'm hearing now as these conversations are occurring.
Thank you.
Present time, there's no indication whatsoever. In fact, it's just the opposite, that Iran would have any intention of going from 20 to 90%. But Professor Long, let's assume for a moment that they do. Then they have the capacity to go into a bomb, make a bomb. All right, now the other thing is that you didn't go into, and I'm disappointed at you because you really are quite knowledgeable about this, the time warning between, doing a bomb and being able to put this on a missile head is tremendous too. So if you could describe that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. The reason I don't talk about that as much is your military option against warhead design is quite different than against fissile material production. So producing highly enriched uranium requires industrial scale facilities that are relatively detectable. Once fissile material is produced, it's a lot harder to target. So the 25 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that are sort of the canonical number you need for a bomb, is tiny, right? It's 50 pounds. It would fit in a couple of those cups we have in front of us. You put it in a suitcase or any sort of shielded container, and it's very difficult to track. Contrast that with a facility, even if it's deeply buried, like Fordo, that can't go anywhere. It's not going to be able to sneak away from you. So that's why I concentrate on the fissile material production. You're absolutely right that once the Iranians have fissile material, it will still take them some time, maybe forever, to design a workable weapon. The North Koreans have had fissile material, plutonium, not uranium, but they've had fissile material since 2002, 2003. They have yet to design a really high-functioning warhead, right? They've had 2 tests, both of which have been fizzles. So you're absolutely right that there's a long trek between fissile material and a bomb, potentially an indefinite trek. But your military option against already produced fissile material is a lot more constrained than your option against the facilities that would produce that fissile material. So you're absolutely right, but I think the right timeline and the reason the Israelis focus on this, and this is what Prime Minister Netanyahu referenced in his UN General Assembly speech, is these facilities, we know where they are and we can target them. Once they've produced fissile material, our ability to confidently target that is very low. So that's why we focus on that rather than the actual warhead design.
As I said in my comments after Austin made his, this was an area of large discussion among people who follow this. And the difference between getting enough of weapons-grade uranium to build a bomb and having the technical capacity to put it on a warhead, and then the possibility of delivering it somehow, all those stretch out. Now, many people said, well, what's to say they're not developing all that in a parallel way so that when they get the highly enriched uranium, they will have a warhead and they'll be able to deliver it somehow. And that is something we have in the footnote because that is the possibility, even though we believe that as of 2003, they stopped their comprehensive development of a nuclear weapon. And the IAEA and Israeli and U.S. intelligence believe that's still the case. As a matter of fact, they say that they have not, they have decided not to continue their weapons development program. But then even if you say that they start quickly to do it and they have a parallel capacity that they've built and they have enough knowledge on the books, then to get the whole thing assembled and even test it, it would take a year. Panetta said a year or more. And then to get a weapons program, and what the Israelis have between 200 and 300 nuclear warheads that they could deliver. And to get to the point where you have a nuclear capacity and a weapons capacity could take many years. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Ali.
Hi, I'm Ali Garib. I write for the Daily Beast. I just wanted to step back to kind of where the report came from. In the report, you guys wrote that, or the authors wrote that that the debate on whether or not to attack Iran has been driven by politics and unexamined assumptions about the efficacy of attacking, some of which you've hit on here. And I agree that this report makes a much-needed contribution. But why is it that our national discourse on this issue has been so bad up until this point? I mean, it's not like this just got into the headlines in the past few months or year, however long the report's been worked on. And where does that come from? And I think it really is a sort of bipartisan thing, even to the point where you have President Obama repeatedly promising that he will, if needed, eventually act to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. But as Leslie Gelb pointed out here, might not be possible. The punchline, as he said, is that it could actually spur Iran to build nuclear weapons. So why has the debate up to this point been so detached from the real possible consequences and real potential efficacy of an attack?
As a frequent contributor to the Daily Beast, I would say this about that. The reason why we can't have a decent debate about this issue or almost any foreign policy issue or almost any domestic issue comes down to two elements of our society. One, a lazy and ignorant press, and two, an ignorant and venal Congress. And when you're dealing with these two as the major intermediaries between information, serious information, and the public, and when they don't begin to play their role, it's hard for the public to get a decent break. You know, here, Bill and several others had the idea to do this report. I think out of the very frustration that your question indicates. And they keep pushing it in the hopes that the press and the Congress will pick it up and begin to do their job. But we can do limited things as a set of foreign policy experts. We need those intermediaries in order to get a serious public debate.
Let me add to it. I agree completely, except I wouldn't be that negative about our Congress because I would not get in the door anymore.
I wasn't there. I was pulling my punches.
When we started this, we wanted to get a fact-based analysis. And we started with a group of military officers last April, May, and we spent a lot of time talking about the issues. And one of the things they kept asking is, what do you want? What would the president want us to do? What would be the objective of the use of military force? And so we begin with this. Do you want to eliminate the program permanently? You ask that question, you can't do it. Then what do you do? If you want to delay the program for 4 or 5 years, you can do that. And the military like to think they can do anything the president asks them to do, but they'd like to know in advance what is the target, what are the targets, what are the objectives, and when is it over? So a lot of it grew out of that first dialogue about how do you prepare and begin to make a decision to use force. And then inevitably, from everything we know, is that the play out of the costs, Les didn't want to play out all the costs that we see in this, and some of them are very speculative because they get out pretty far. But we do raise in this paper a lot of significant consequences that in most cases, when you go to war, you don't think a lot about. So I think what we decided to do was get the front end right and think a lot about the back end. What do you want us to do? What do you want the military to do? And then once they've done it, how do you play out what this may mean for U.S. interests around the world? Is that fair?
I agree with that. I would just add that it's not only what do you want done, but how will we know whether or not we did it? Being able to measure the effects of your actions is very important.
Okay. Thank you, Ali.
My name is Rafael Badri. I'm a physician from Cleveland, Ohio. And I'm here because
I didn't hear your name.
Rafael Badri from Cleveland, Ohio. And I'm disappointed the fact that the topic in general has been Israel against the military might or against the nuclear might of Iran, while in fact it is the U.S. that stands to lose most if Iran is, let alone, running with its nuclear proliferation. If we go back in history to the days of the American presence in Iraq, first the cost got inflated simply because the Iranians supported every wacko jihadist that wanted to bomb himself or blow himself and come over to Iraq through Syria and even through Iran. The continued war in Afghanistan is because of Iran supplying the Taliban with the financing and the arms they need. So the bottom line is that, and of course, don't forget the issue of what the Iranians have done in Beirut with the Marines. It cost so many innocent lives, and that was thanks to Hezbollah, the arm of Iran in southern Lebanon. the issue here that I think about is the reverse question. What if nothing gets to be done? Where are the Iranians going to go? And how far the Iranians are going to keep on proliferating their nuclear proliferation to an extent they're going to threaten
So that-
the American presence in the Gulf?
So that's your question?
Yes.
Let me try to begin with by saying that you're right, exactly right, that the reason we did this is because we have this real problem with Iran. They are a threat to us not only because of their nuclear program, but in many areas, in Iraq, in other places, in which we have committed forces, have deep interests, and see their role as being not only not helpful, but really damaging and contrary to what we want to achieve. So you're right that it's much broader than just the Iran thing, just the weapons thing. And we have in the paper discussed the other concerns we have, which are serious, and in some cases, some of us believe more serious than the nuclear question. The current debate that has gone on between the United States and Israel and within the U.S. government now relates specifically to the nuclear. The debate has been around that issue. And that's not to say if the nuclear wasn't there, there would be other reasons that would come up. So we've addressed basically this paper around the subject of the nuclear question. And as you know, many of the sanctions that we have against Iran are not related only to nuclear. They're related to human rights, to their activities, support of Hezbollah and Hamas, their attitude toward Israel. So a lot of reasons why we have problems with Iran, but we take your point. So.
And I would just add, we do address the potential use of U.S. military force. I mean, as Les said, nobody that signed the paper thought U.S. military force should be off the table. It's just you need as accurate an accounting of what force can get you and what force is going to cost you. And then you can make, I think, an informed decision about whether it's worth it. And that applies both to Israel and the United States. The reason I talked a good bit about the differences is the military capacity between the two is different, and that makes the timeline to act different. And I think, as I said, the defense minister and the prime minister of Israel have said essentially the same thing. So I don't think there's any disagreement there. It's just a question of when's the latest time you can potentially act, and it's just different for the two countries for that reason.
Yeah, and nobody's undervaluing the Israeli capacity and the IDF's ability to do real damage. There is a major limitation on Israel is the fact that they don't have an unlimited time to do it. They've got to do most of what they want to do probably in one night. They might go back one more time, but if the United States can do it over weeks, months, even longer, which we have the capacity to do, obviously it's not a suggestion the United States is a lot better at this, but they just have more power over a longer period of time that can do much more damage than Israel can do. Okay, any other questions? Are you all lined up? Why don't you take a couple at a time if you could.
Okay, I can take, I have two quick questions. My name is Sune Engel Rasmussen. I'm from Denmark, and I've spent a while in Iran. I just want to say thank you very much for the program, for the report. It's really refreshing to read something that's as unpoliticized as this. Really refreshing. My first question is related to the aftermath of a potential attack. You haven't touched that much upon this subject here. Whether or not U.S. troops will be committed on the ground, how long we're talking, what are the perspectives, what are the costs, different assessments are flying around, and it's difficult without a military background as myself to get a clear idea of this. I don't know if this is something you've discussed during your work here. My second question is, and please, if you don't feel in position to answer this, don't, but the efficiency of sanctions against Iran. My experience is that this hits the Iranian people a lot more than it hits the government, but now, within the past couple of weeks, The Iranian government has started to change its behavior. I don't know what the signals, but I would be interested to get your assessment of the efficiency of sanctions and the possibility of negotiating with Iran, if there is a possibility at all. Thanks.
You want to talk about troops on the ground, or you want? But we have it in there, in the paper. We say that in order to achieve regime change and our total capitulation to all of our demands, it probably won't be enough to use force from outside, but we probably would have to go on the ground, and our estimate there is that it would probably be more costly in lives and money than Afghanistan and Iraq combined. Not only because Iran is a much larger country than either of those, but they're also more together. I don't think anybody has publicly talked about the use of military force on the ground. I don't think there would be easy consensus for that, but I'm sure there's a little shelf in the Pentagon somewhere which deals with that as an option. They have to have that, but I don't know. It seems to me unlikely that would be something we don't really discuss it in this country. That isn't debated, is it?
But let me just say a word about negotiations, if I may.
Yeah.
I ascribe generally the worst motives to Iran. I generally think they're up to no good. We've dealt with a lot of nations in our history that are up to no good. That doesn't mean, ipso facto, that you don't negotiate. We have our own interests in negotiation. And we're not so stupid that we can't put forward proposals that protect our interests, as well as seek some common ground. I don't get into arguments over exactly what the Iranians are planning and what they're going to do. I don't know. I can't prove it. Nobody else can prove it. Maybe the Iranians themselves don't know exactly what they're going to do. But I am a firm believer of putting forth proposals in our interests in order to find out. And I'd rather do that first than go to war first and try to solve the problem that way. We shouldn't fear to negotiate because we can protect our interests by that means as well. And we've learned that by history, as well as learning that there really are bad guys in the world.
Thank you, Les. I do think it's important to point out that in this paper we don't deal with that issue. We don't deal with alternatives to military force, as I indicated. On the sanctions question, we hope to have a paper like this in the next 3 weeks or more on specifically on the weighing the balance between the benefits and costs of sanctions against Iran.
Let me just throw in on sanctions really quickly. I think most observers, including the Israeli Foreign Ministry in a leaked report recently, suggest that the current round of sanctions are much more damaging than any previous round. My own experience was in June. I was in Herat in western Afghanistan and talked to a lot of Afghans who went back and forth, some of whom actually lived in Iran. And they sort of confirmed that as well, that the rial has collapsed, that there's not widespread shortages, but some things are much harder in some cases to get than they used to. So I think they're hurting. I think probably what the paper Bill's talking about will at least partly address is, are they hurting enough, right? We talked a little bit about coercion from the military perspective, but sanctions are basically another coercive tool. And if people are really committed to something, even if something's extraordinarily painful, they may still stick with it. So, that's at least sort of my perspective on sanctions. The current round is enormously effective. It's still an open question whether they will be sufficiently effective.
Hi, I'm Max Martyr. I'm a first-year ISP student here at SIPA. I just wanted to ask a quick question about the topic of Iranian civilian casualties from a potential strike. This has been in the news a little bit more this week. There's a piece in The Atlantic by Golnaz Esfandiari saying that an attack on Iranian nuclear sites, particularly at Isfahan, could cause between 5,000 and 80,000 Iranian civilian casualties. It's just my perception that, you know, if you're talking about like Kosovo, there was more of a, I don't know, need to address possible Serb civilian casualties than there is, you know, in this debate about possible Iranian civilian casualties. So I just want to know if that entered your calculations as far as the cost of a potential strike or not.
Sure, this is, again, something I've tried to think about a lot over the past few years. So Esfahan, the reason Esfahan, and to a lesser extent Fordo and Natanz, that can cause massive civilian casualties potentially, is uranium hexafluoride, which is the uranium compound used for enrichment. When it's exposed to water vapor, it undergoes a chemical reaction, and it becomes hydrofluoric acid, which is a really, you know, powerful acid, and a uranium precipitate, which is very toxic. So the big question, and I have literally talked to tons of nuclear chemists about this, and because I think it's nothing like this has ever happened, nobody can give me a really good answer, is how big and widespread would the plume be? So this is, you know, this is stuff that's going to be exploding, so it's going to be driven up, but it's very heavy. Uranium is much, much heavier than air. Hydrofluoric acid is somewhat heavier than air. So the question is this going to be an explosion that blasts this stuff up just, you know, a few hundred feet and might contaminate the area immediately around the target? Or is it going to, you know, go up several thousand feet and spread over, you know, the area of the city of Esfahan? It's an open question. My own instinct, looking at it, looking at the amount of material we're talking about, is that it's probably going to be less rather than more widespread. But because, as I say, you talk to people at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, chemists at MIT, and they're like, yeah, we've had small-scale releases of UF6 from Oak Ridge and other places, but to my knowledge, no one has ever blown up tons of the stuff. So it's really an open question.
Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Aaron Schwartz. I'm actually a former student here.
Would you speak in the microphone?
Sure. My name is Aaron Schwartz. I'm a former student at SEPA. I'd like to thank you for the report. It's very interesting. I noticed in the conclusions or the costs of a military action, it's mentioned that it would convince the Iranian regime that the United States is earnestly seeking regime change. My question is the U.S. policy currently not seeking regime change? And if it isn't there something wrong with that, at least stating it? I thought it was clear that we are interested in the regime being replaced because the regime is actually the problem, not whether they have nuclear weapons or not. If they were a democracy, liberal democracy, I don't think anyone would have a problem with them having a nuclear weapon. France, England, and other countries have those. So that was one point. The other point states to an increased rage against the United States after such an attack. Again, how is that different from the level of rage there is today in the Muslim world? It seems to me the rage is consistent, it's constant, and only the official reason for that rage is what changes from one episode to the next. One time it's cartoons, the other is a video, etc. So it seems to me a kind of a point that maybe if you can elaborate on it. And again, I know that the project is aiming to produce more reports. Ambassador, you mentioned a report on sanctions, the efficacy of sanctions. So just to, I don't mean to pressure you for more reports, but it would be interesting to have a report that weighs benefits.
You're depressed about receiving more reports?
No, I don't want to pressure you for more reports because I know you're busy. But it seems to me it would be interesting to have a report that weighs the benefits of costs of not doing anything about Iran for the U.S. interests and national security. Thanks.
Well, do you want to ask one? Why don't we take another question now? Would you take some? We'll answer those three.
My name is Dirk van der Laan. I'm with the School of General Studies. And I suppose I just have a two-part question for the panel in general. Would our decision to use military action against Iran be predicated more on their simply possessing a nuclear weapon or on their intentions of using a nuclear weapon if they had one? And if so, how strong is our ability to determine their intentions of using one if they had it?
Okay.
Is that for
Understand
me?
question? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I think you aimed the question at me, but I don't think the answer is a military answer. It's a policy answer.
It's more, yeah, I suppose it would be more of a policy answer, is our ability to use, our ability to measure the intentions of Iran carrying out a proposed threat of using a nuclear weapon, if we can determine that, or is it just if they had a nuclear weapon, we would automatically, lean towards military action?
Yeah, that's a policy question. I think the paper doesn't address that for that reason, but it's also a question that the administration is facing from others. Do we have red lines? Should we have red lines? What is it that would stimulate some sort of a U.S. action? And clearly, this paper is not about all of that. This is about what the costs and benefits of such action would be.
Thank you.
Do you want to go to the other questions? The regime change question that was asked? Remember that one?
Well, paper doesn't deal with that either. In order to do what we did, you have to stay away from these other questions, but those questions really are fundamental. They're certainly on the minds of the Iranian leaders. Do they think that our real aim is regime change? They probably do, and it probably affects their willingness to deal with this problem in ways satisfactory to us. Do we secretly want regime change? Guess what?
Let me add to that. I agree that in Washington there is somewhere back there regime change as an end goal, but believe me, that was the attitude toward the Soviet Union for all the years if these guys would just go away, it'd be much easier. Regime changed. It wasn't brought about by us, but we certainly helped. I think one of the problems, the paradox here is that, and I'm getting outside of the paper, but if we want regime change, and that's what all our policy is driving for, we're probably never going to get a negotiated settlement. Because you have to make deals that might involve certain things that would unravel your regime change policies. So it's a paradox which is historic. And so at some point, how we deal with that contrast between the policies we're conducting and our objectives in trying to deal with them is going to be a problem. The other question you asked was about the rage. Will the rage increase? And I guess, I don't know. I think our assumption is it would increase, but you're saying why would it be just more of the same? The rage is so high against us out there. I don't know. Russ, do you have any?
No, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a problem. In Syria, the opposition keeps saying that if this keeps on much longer, you're going to have a lot of jihadists who are created out of whole cloth. The next generation of young people will become much more inclined to enter into wars, the jihads against the West, against the United States. This can't be calibrated, but we do have it in there. We suggest it. And to your last point, why don't we have a paper? What are the benefits and costs of not doing something? That's important, no question about it. And people have asked that approach, and I guess in the paper, implicit in this paper is that issue. That if we may actually end up having to use force, as we may have to do, a president will have concluded that despite the high costs that we've laid out and that probably he's thought about, the overriding interest for the United States, for some of the reasons we have explained on the benefit side, will drive him to that. Anyway, I hope that's satisfying.
Let me just add a word about regime change, because it is so fundamental to most foreign policy questions. If you go back, as Bill just did with the Soviet Union, our Soviet experts argued for a policy of containment. And they argued for containment because they believed that if we could only avoid catastrophe really to ourselves, that the Soviet regime was so rotten, so corrupt, that it eventually would implode from within. Now, I think in the end that's precisely what happened. And even as we held to that belief and held to that policy, the right policy, we negotiated with the Soviets in order to avoid other problems that could cause us harm as well as the Soviets. And I think the same issue arises with the Iranians. But if they think our aim in every move is simply to remove them from power, it removes their incentive to look at the proposals we might make with any degree of interest.
Can I jump in a couple points?
Go ahead.
So on the regime change question, I think the heart of your question is, don't they already think we're going for regime change? So what does it matter if they know we're going for regime change? It's the difference between covert action and overt action. And their response could be very different. So it was mentioned earlier that the Iranians support the Taliban in Afghanistan. There's some evidence to suggest that. But the support is much less than they provided with their proxies in Iraq. That's a variable, not a constant. They could certainly adjust their support. And indeed, part of the reason they probably don't provide that much support, among other things, is they fear U.S. potential retaliation. If the U.S. is already bombing them, obviously your fear of retaliation is going to be slightly less, though maybe you fear that the U.S. will then actually invade. In other words, the regime change threat will become completely actualized. So I think you can paint a variety of ways in which an Iranian regime that's 100% convinced we want to overthrow the regime could respond differently than one that just kind of sort of knows we want to do it on the sly and on the cheap. On the intentions versus capabilities question, this is the perennial problem for intelligence analysts. Capabilities tend to be, however opaque they are, much easier to analyze than intentions, because you can count stuff and you can point at stuff. They have this many missiles. Their planes have this long a range, whatever. Intentions are opaque, and my frustration over the past year, and I was talking with Laskel before the panel, we try and read the Iranians, who are pretty opaque. Well, we're quite close to the Israelis, and reading their intentions these days is pretty opaque, even though their capabilities are not. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Even with your friends, it can be tough to read what they're actually going to do. With those that you have the fairly minimal ties that we currently have with Iran, it's that much more difficult. So I don't think anybody wants to bet the farm if you think that's what we're betting on reading Iranian intentions.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Alfonso Diaz.
Could you speak into the mic?
Further or closer? Because I have to.
Okay, there.
Okay.
Okay.
Did your paper consider the reaction, the possible reaction of Putin's Russia, China, Turkey, even Egypt, even Sunni Egypt? Thank you.
What would be the reaction of these countries to a military strike?
Did the paper consider?
Yes.
Oh, did they consider?
And even if your paper does not address that point, could you illustrate to us what are your views, please?
Do you want to answer? We did.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, go ahead.
Okay. We did to some extent. We didn't consider every possible country's reaction, but you're right to highlight Russia as a particularly big question mark. one thing that Russia has decided not to do that could quite easily change following military action is the sale of advanced surface-to-air missiles. The Russians have said because Iran is formally under the sanctions they're not going to sell these weapons to them. That was a presidential decision by President Medvedev. President Putin could reverse that essentially overnight. In terms of support for sanctions, military action can undermine support for sanctions quite quickly, depending on the context. We talk about that as a definite cost. It took a lot of effort to cobble together the sanctions we have, and part of the reason countries were willing to sign on to them is as an alternative to the use of force. If force is then used, again, depending on the context, it may be much harder to hold sanctions together. So we did look at the reaction of some countries, but not all countries. And you're right to highlight Russia and China as being two of the big ones.
It's throughout the whole cost section, this issue. One of them was that if we find that they are actually crashing toward building a nuclear weapon, and we went to the Security Council and said, look, the world has opposed this, is it appropriate now to use under Security Council resolution a military action against Iran? And I guess the consensus was that there probably would be some countries that would support it, and yet both China and Russia would probably end up vetoing it, even though it might reduce to some degree their anxiety over the action. It would not change it fundamentally. And we've talked about the coalition against Iran would be broken dramatically, and there are just a lot of ways in which we discuss that, particularly in the Middle East, and how we think that many governments in the Middle East would express quiet support for attack against Iran, but the populations would not. So these are all rough estimates, and we sort of apologize for that speculation. Any other questions?
Earlier, the issue of the difficulty of building a rocket was brought up, and they are very difficult to build, but that's for an immediate crisis. How secure are national borders really against simply smuggling one of these things across the border, especially given the worldwide war on drugs tendency to create corrupt border offices where you could simply hide it inside the cocaine and have it sail right through the border in many places around the world, presumably. And even if the US and Israel had a secure border, could you really assume that Saudi Arabia had a secure border, since that would be one of the big regional tensions?
Okay, let's get one more question. Sure.
Yes, my name is Jim Dingman. I'm from Pacifica Radio. In your analysis, have you incorporated any kind of interpretation of the Iranian conventional order of battle and unconventional order of battle, and how they would respond to a direct attack on their national sovereignty, which such an air campaign, whether it's mounted by us or Israel, would mean?
Okay, one more.
Charles Falcon, an alum. In the cost evaluations that you did you integrate the economic cost, long-term economic cost to the world economy of interruption of the flow of oil, price of oil, etc.? Thank you.
Do you want to deal first with the sneaking it across the border issue and and then the conventional capacity?
Sure. In terms of sneaking things across the border, this is a canonical scenario that terrorists could potentially get their hands on a weapon, or a state could choose to do so unconventionally. The thing to realize, though, is, as Bill alluded to, we're talking about an Iran that in the near term is going to possess, at best, 1 or 2 weapons. This is going to have taken them more than 20 years to get to. It's considered unlikely, and I think rightly so, that they would then just pawn that off on a terrorist organization, right? This is in a sense their get-out-of-jail-free card against regime change, believing that, and I think rightly, the United States is not going to actively try to change the regime if even 1 or 2 nuclear weapons is in their possession. So if you believe the regime is essentially suicidal and just bent on delivering a nuclear weapon somewhere, that's probably a real concern. I think the consensus on the paper was that the regime is not suicidal. Is that fair?
I think that's right. And
But,
then-
but how would you know who actually delivered it? Like,
Well-
how would you know to blame them versus any number of other actors who also have nukes?
There's a couple of ways. So one, there aren't that many actors, right? I mean, you could point to maybe Pakistan. Two, there's a science called nuclear forensics that the United States has spent a lot of time developing. And three, if you're Iran, do you really want to literally bet the farm and your entire country on the fact that the United States won't simply flatten you on general principle after a nuclear weapon goes off in the United States? Again, I think the regime has to be, at a minimum, highly risk acceptant, if not out and out suicidal, in order to do this.
Deal with the conventional weapons.
Sure. I mean, the conventional and unconventional capacity we do talk about a little bit. And, you know, the way I frame the issue is, you know, the Iranian day after, what's their response going to be? And it can really fall into two sort of basic categories. One we talk about is a sort of cold-blooded, rational, strategic response. And particularly against an Israeli effort, their best bet is probably to respond in a fairly limited way. We mentioned in the cost sections the fact that Israeli military action is likely to cause the sanctions regime to weaken, if not out and out collapse. The position of Russia and China will probably change. As I said, they can probably increase their conventional air defense capability following an Israeli strike. You know, they may have an excuse, should they be looking for it, to kick the IAEA inspectors out, saying essentially all you guys do is provide targeting data to the Zionist entity, so get out. There's a lot of upside for the Iranians that comes out of a strike if their response is essentially proportionate, right? They launch a limited conventional strike and some fairly deniable covert actions against Israeli interests. That's a pretty cold-blooded response to an attack on your country. And so the other sort of lane that they could go down is a more emotional response. People do tend to flip out when their countries are attacked. Everybody in this room lived through the experience of September 11th. And what the American public and the American government's attitude was thereafter. So, you know, people can respond emotionally. In terms of their conventional capability, what can they do? You know, one of the big threats, and somebody mentioned oil, is their capacity to try and close the Strait of Hormuz. I'm happy to go in detail maybe after this because it gets very technical on what they can and can't do, but the reality is they can probably close the strait for a limited period of time in a way that would make it more difficult for the U.S. to reopen. A lot in that, though, depends on them being able to sort of get mines in the water very quickly. And so there's a big first mover advantage there. In terms of their asymmetric capability, they have developed extensive asymmetric capability. I mentioned the possibility of providing additional support to the Taliban. You've seen a variety of attacks around the world attributed to Iran or its proxies, so clearly they have some of that capability. So there's a lot they could do, and we definitely talk about all of those as costs. But bear in mind, after an Israeli attack particularly, if Iran sort of, you know, cashes all its chips in and starts trying to close the Strait of Hormuz, that's almost guaranteed to draw a United States response. And there are some in Israel who think that that's actually the best outcome they get from an attack, is catalyzing an Iranian response that then draws in a U.S. response. Now, there are equally people in Israel who think that's the dumbest thing they've ever heard, but it's a not implausible scenario, and you can see why if you're you know, sort of hopeful for what military action can do, that's one way it could be very effective, is to catalyze escalation between Iran and the United States.
Good. All right, maybe I'll ask each of you to wrap it up, what you'd like to, what you think you didn't say that you'd like to have said. The one last question was, did we consider the economic dimensions of this, the cost? And we tried. We certainly predict a spike in oil prices. We suggest that the Strait of Hormuz may be closed for a while. The damage to a world economy struggling to get itself together. I mean, we tried to put numbers on the cost of actually using military force, projecting a couple of weeks strikes of the part of the United States or a month. And we finally found that this wasn't doable. It's so difficult to predict all these issues and have an estimate of how much it would cost, at what scale, depending on what the targets were for the United States to go for a week, 2 weeks, a month. So we gave up. I'm sorry, but we know it's big. You want us to?
I'll start somewhere else. I got to think for a minute.
Okay.
I'll just say that, that I believe, well, I'm certain that military commanders generally consider their role to put options on the table, not take them off, and offer additional solutions for the president and the national decision authorities to consider. And I think that in my view, that's a primary purpose of this paper, is to stimulate what I called exploring the gap short of traditional military operations, and as was stated clearly here, without taking the large-scale kinetic military operation off the table at all, just considering all that might be done before reaching a decision to do that and evaluating the potential consequences. And I'll close with a little vignette back to Vietnam. Harry Summers was an Army colonel in Vietnam. He later became an historian and an author, and in researching a book on Vietnam, he went back to interview General Giap, who was the commander of the North Vietnamese Army forces, and who, by the way, celebrated his 101st birthday a couple of months ago. He talked to a deputy of General Giap's, and he reminded Colonel Tu that Vietnam never defeated United States forces in a battle on the battlefield. And Colonel Tu's response was, "That's true, it's also irrelevant." That this is a far more sophisticated issue than simply can the military capability, the military objectives be achieved.
Les?
The Admiral took the words right out of my mouth.
But that's an editorializing. Okay. Okay. Thank you all for coming. I hope you'll appreciate the detached manner in which we've dealt with this extremely important issue that we're facing in this country, and hope you'll help us get the word out.